Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. A big shout out to Furby Books. Their partnership allows us to bring authors to the screen, so we are very grateful for their support. We are really pleased to have Bryn Turnbull back with us today at the Coburg Library. Bryn writes historical fiction, and she's here to discuss her latest book, The Last Grand Duchess, a sweeping novel that takes readers behind the palace walls to see the end of Imperial Russia through the eyes of Olga Romanov, first daughter of the last tsar. Ashley Pimenter is our host today. When she's not curled up with a good book, Ashley creates and supports programming to support the kids who are part of Girl Guides of Canada. She is also the co-chair of the Red Maple Award Steering Committee and writes reviews for the Canadian Children's Book News. So welcome, Bryn and Ashley. And Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be back. Being with you as a virtual audience is just such a delight. And we have the fabulous Bryn Turnbull with us. And we are going to talk about this amazing book, which looks much nicer in real life. Excuse my ARC copy here.
I've got it right here. Yay.
Beautiful. It's so beautiful. As always, like we talked last time about like just how Harlequin imprints do the most evocative covers. And I have to admit, I just loved having this one like sitting around. And so last time we talked about The Woman Before Wallace and had this wonderful conversation about your desire to find women in the cracks of history, which like is just like to this day has just sat with me in the like when I pick more historical fiction, I find that those are the stories I'm drawn to. And my own personal experience with the Russian Revolution has always been around Anastasia and the mystery of Anastasia. And like, thank you very much, children's movies, for making that whole thing as well. But in your book, you focus on Olga and this idea of the not heir, although the eldest Romanov child. And I was so curious about what drew you to the story of Olga.
Yeah, you're right. Like the entry point for so many people into this story is through Anastasia and through that lovely animated movie about Anastasia. And they hit kind of these, they hit the big notes, right? It's Rasputin, it's, the Pretenders, all of that, it's a really interesting story. But the thing that always kind of got me about the Anastasia story is the Anastasia story isn't about any of the Romanovs. Really, it's not even about Anastasia. It's about her pretenders. And that's fantastic. I mean, it's an undeniably fascinating tale, but too much, I think so much of the Romanov lore focuses on the pretenders or focuses on Nicholas and Alexandra and their son Alexei's struggles with hemophilia, his battle with hemophilia. And as a result, we've got these four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and their story kind of gets lost in the fray. Even during their own lifetime, they were referred to as Otma, O-T-M-A, which was an amalgamation of all their first names. And so, yeah. And so, in the history books, they're kind of taken as this entity. In retellings of the story, it's always sort of these other stories that take center stage. And so for me, I really wanted to look at the family as a family, and I wanted to look at the daughters specifically as individuals. And in Olga, I found just this remarkably compelling heroine. I had it in my head that Olga was a kind of shy, retiring sort just because so much of, the historical record kind of washes over her. But when I looked into it, I found no, this woman was, she was an active nurse during the First World War. She was incredibly compassionate. She could see Russian society in a way that I think her parents couldn't. And when Rasputin was murdered, one of the biggest tells in contemporary sources about her, a couple sort of eyewitness accounts talk about her saying that when Rasputin was murdered, her response was, "I understand why they did it." And so, okay, so she's politically aware, she's politically savvy. So all of that coalesced. And then, not even to get into the romances that she had, here's this young woman who's viewed as a child because that's how history remembers her. But she wasn't a child. She was a young woman, and she had this remarkable life. And it was such a privilege to be able to learn more about her and to bring her story, bring her story back into, into our world.
Such an interesting, I never thought of it before. So I'm just like, I'm going to form this thought because your response was just so rich and thought provoking. Of one of the interesting things is that you're totally right. They're lumped together as the daughters, not as these individual souls. And also this idea that Olga was a young woman. So there's almost like a teen YA feel to this book in places, because you're like, oh, right. But due to the subject matter, obviously does not fit right as nicely in that. So you've kind of transcended a little bit of genre here. So kudos to you. I just had never thought about this, but my teenage self, I was drawn back to I was thinking about some Danielle Steele novels I had read in the 9th grade that also look at a very fantastical version of the Russian Revolution that is not as grounded as this one. And it's such a fascinating period in time. And you've just captured it in such a way that in my own reading, I haven't read before, but also it's one of those books that I can see my mom handing my 14-year-old self and being like, you might like this one too, because she was my entryway into romance novels as a teenager, because I just needed something. And they were this thick. And I was like, yes. And this one just it has the perfect amount of story and drive and really pulls people in. And as I'm rambling on about this, one of the things that I really loved in this is how you brought Olga's voice to life. And you brought this person who, again, is always sort of in the sidelines and was never really spotlighted, to this fully formed human being. Well, fictional human being, obviously. You're not magical as much as I would like to. And I'm just really curious, because as a historical fiction author, where do you find these voices that you're channeling into your writing, especially when we don't actually have Olga's actual voice? We've got a few of these little snippets. Who do you channel to create these pieces?
So we don't have Olga's actual voice, but what we do have are her diaries. And they were translated into English maybe sort of 7-8 years ago by an American historian named Helen Azar. And those diaries gave me such a unique view into her life, because, you're reading them and you think, oh, she's a Grand Duchess. It's going to be all about the balls and going to church and, doing the big events. And there is that. But despite the fact that Olga surely understood that she was writing for posterity, you get snippets into this young woman, this young woman that she was, as well as all of that. You have her talking about how, her mother's ill again, and she's got to take over, and, she's got to take on the duties of her mother because her mom can't do it. And that kind of, having that kind of burden of caregiving over and over and over again, you can hear the exasperation in her entries about that. And you get snippets about the other daughters. She talks about Anastasia breeding worms, which makes its way into my book, because I thought that was just such a wonderful detail. And she talks about roller skating on board the yacht that her father had, and skinny dipping in Finland on holiday, and her romances. And she uses these sort of little code names to talk about the objects of her affection. And so, yes, on the one hand, she's a public figure. She's a Grand Duchess. She's, covered in jewels, bedecked out, and is a symbol of this monarchy. But she's also just a young woman, and she's trying to live a young woman's life. And I thought that was just such an interesting kind of dynamic to play with, that push and pull between duty and individuality, and how do you break out from that, the symbol that is pushed upon you from birth to become who you are. So yeah, it is sort of young YA in that regard. That's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
No, I had no idea there was a diary. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
If only all historical fiction, we're like, oh, look, mysteriously a diary appeared, and we had that piece. Must have been just such a great read. So now audience, once you've read this, now you have to find the diary and read the diary.
Yes.
And then you can be like, oh yes, very nicely aligned. Although I did love in your author notes, like one of the pieces that you point out is that part of the fun of writing historical fiction instead of historical nonfiction is your ability to storytell and your ability to play with these people and enrich their lives in slightly various ways. Like you mentioned, like you'd change some of her romances ever so slightly to create a little bit more of a richer experience for the reader, which I appreciate hearing it afterwards. And like some of the little bits and pieces that just to explain the narrative arc. And I just love that you included that at the end to just give us all like that grounding in historical context, but the reminder about the joy of reading historical fiction and giving us this like little bit extra. So kudos to that as well. So last time I realized that I got to read your book and I got to enjoy your writing, and the same has happened here. And I think that it was actually like, as we're talking about voice and we're talking about this experience, I think it'd be really great to like give our audience a chance to actually step into your writing. And so we had talked about a little piece on page 20 of my copy. I don't know if it's page 20 in your copy. Just to give them a little bit of like a taste of like what would be in store in terms of just the way that you have captured this like moment in time for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do a bit of a reading. So this part is from the prologue of the book. So Olga is she's a child at this point, and Alexei is is struggling through hemophilia, and it's becoming quite clear that this is a very life-threatening moment for her younger brother and for the heir to the Russian throne. So at this point in the book, she's talking to her grandmother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, and she's having this conversation talking about sort of the dynasty and succession and what happens. Olga knew that she was pushing past the bounds of propriety, that such questions were impertinent at the best of times. The fact that Grandmama was willing to discuss such matters at all was surprising to Olga, but then perhaps Grandmama was too weary to object. If he's taken into God's arms, Olga paused. Voicing the possibility aloud was enough to make her feel as though she was falling, but she took a breath and continued. If the worst is to happen, tell Mama and Papa not to worry about Russia. I will carry on. For Alexei, for Papa, I will become the Tsarevich. Grandmama's eyes welled with tears. She looked across the room, blinking them back as best she could. Bless you, my dear, she said. You're a good girl, and I know you mean well, but that's simply not the way of things. Why not? Asked Olga, trembling. Much as the prospect terrified her, she knew it was right. It would ease Papa's burden if she were to take on the heavy mantle of his succession. If they can't have another son, somebody needs to do it. Someone needs to inherit Papa's throne. I'm his eldest child. I can be his heir. Grandmama kissed the crown of her head. Across the room, Aunt Olga lifted a sleeping Anastasia into her arms. I'm afraid it's not that simple. There are laws in place that prevent a woman from becoming Tsar. But Grandmother Victoria was Queen of England. That's true, said Grandmama. Russia, however, is a very different country. Catherine the Great? Grandmama sighed. They changed the laws after Catherine. It would have been much easier for your parents if that hadn't been the case, but it's God's will. When you and your sisters are grown up, you'll marry into other royal families. That is the destiny of a Grand Duchess, to bear children and to build a life in a new country, like your mother, like me before her. The idea was unthinkable. Leave her family to carry on without her? Leave Russia without a Tsarevich? Olga's future loomed before her, bleak and terrible. Alexei constantly battling this incurable disease. Olga herself cast out of Russia, out of her family because she had been born a girl. Mama and Papa locked forever in their grief, watching the dynasty crumble in their hands, while Olga was too far away to help them, too powerless to save her brother, powerless to save Russia. Courage, my dear, said Grandmama. God may yet provide. Olga let the tears she tried so hard to hold back fall, unconcealed, down her cheeks. How can I have courage when I'm so scared? Grandmama gathered Olga close, enveloping her in the comforting scent of lily of the valley. My darling girl, courage does not mean a lack of fear, she said. It means meeting whatever the future may hold with grace.
Oh, I know I've already read it. And I'm like having this moment of like, I'm having some feelings being like, oh, it is just this reminder that historical figures have families and that royalty and these big structures that seem so far away are people who are interacting with other people. And one of the reasons I picked this one and not like something further in the book, not just because I didn't want to give away anything later on, was because it really just sets this tone of Olga, that this is the Olga you are going to meet. This is the Olga who is willing to sacrifice anything for her family and is willing to just do what needs to be done for her country. And it's just this like really beautiful little piece that I think everybody can relate with, no matter what your country is and where you're coming from, is this piece of family and like your role in your world, whatever your world may be. In this case, quite a decadent world, which is fun to read about. It's more fun to read about than some other pieces.
You know what? For me, people have such strong feelings about the Romanovs, rightly so. And depending on what side of the political, depending where in history and what side of the political spectrum we fall, they are saints or they are, sinners. They're the symbol of this, horrible totalitarian regime, or they are martyrs to a lost world. And that's all absolutely part of their story. But the thing that was intriguing to me was I wanted to look at them as a family, first and foremost, because that was how they viewed themselves. This was an incredibly devoted family, and families have their virtues and their flaws. And so it was important to me not to try and, lionize them, not to vilify them, but look at them from the perspective of a daughter who, can see the cracks in the foundation and can see that the world that her parents inhabit and the world that her parents kind of are building is not benefiting everybody, but she still loves her parents, right? So there's that push and pull for her between seeing what her parents are doing, seeing who they are politically, and reconciling that with who they are as individuals and as family members, and as very loving family members. So
yeah, that's kind of it. Yeah, when you think about that, it's kind of nice to be like, it's a loving family, and to have that moment of being like, oh yeah, like there wasn't that type of trauma built into this story either, because there wasn't that type of trauma in their family. They loved each other so deeply. And I feel like you really really came across in your book as well, this really deep sense of love. And as you just highlighted in your storytelling, is that history and war and revolution is very nuanced and very complicated. And as like you and I were talking a few minutes before this interview, given with what's happening in our current world, this poor book came out right before it all happened. And now everyone is looking at Russia and has these opinions. But as a writer and as somebody who is like you as a writer and as you who appreciate history and the way history unfolds, why do you think it is so important to give voice to these nuances in history?
Well, because, history is the culmination of 1,000 decisions made by 1,000 different people. And it's easy to see things reductively, and it's easy not to realize what's happening in the moment, right? It's easy to not realize that the decisions that you're making, the stone that you throw in the water is going to create a ripple that creates a wave that creates, chaos. And so in this book, the thing that really kind of drove home to me was Olga she's kind of on both sides, right? Because she's a symbol of her parents' totalitarian regime, and she also becomes a victim of that regime. She becomes a victim of the decisions that are made in this war, but she also sees it in a very different way because she's a nurse. So she not only bears the consequences of totalitarianism and war, but she also sees those consequences firsthand, which I think gives her that greater understanding of just how unjust and how awful these circumstances can be. And, being there, being so close to the room and realizing that you cannot do anything to stop it. All you can do is hold on and try to kind of let yourself get buffeted by the tide to safer shores. It's terrible. We're seeing that in Ukraine right now. We're seeing the horrible impacts of the decision of a group of men very far away who are not, who are not taking into account the individual lives that are being that are being impacted and ended by this horrible conflict. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how it all plays out. But I do want to say on my website, I have a list of organizations, charities that are doing incredible work helping in Ukraine. So if you are looking for a way to support people on the ground who are helping the people of Ukraine, please check out my website. It's on my blog. Yeah.
And that's fabulous. And I know that there are many Russians who are also appreciating that you are still bringing voice to their history and the importance of their stories, and the fact that this is so nuanced and that they may not have been part of the room that made that decision. And so it's a tricky part in our own lived history. And this was a tricky part in Olga's lived history. And I cannot recommend this book enough. And if you are looking for a copy, as I'm sure Beth will tell you, you can get a copy at the Cobourg Public Library or at Furby House Books. We have them right front and center. You can't miss them. If you come on Tuesday morning, you can come and say hi. Thank you so much, Bryn.
Oh, thank you. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you both for having me.
Yes, thank you, Bryn, and thank you, Ashley. Yes, Ashley, thank you for the plug. Of course, the book is here at the Cobourg Public Library and Furby House. We hope you all run out and get yourself a copy of The Last Grand Duchess. Thank you all for joining us today, and take care, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.